Well, this morning, before I even begin, this sermon represents the halfway point in that series that we're doing called The Upside Down Kingdom. The series is not only unique because of the theme, this uniqueness about an inverted kingdom, but it's also unique because all these sermons are coming from just one chapter in Mark's Gospel, the 10th chapter. Our sermon 2 weeks ago dealt with Jesus' harsh words about divorce. And we worked through that beloved scene where Jesus said to let the little children come unto him. So in a moment, I want to go back to that week just for a second. But this whole idea behind this series is that here in Mark's gospel, Jesus is demonstrating that things don't work the same way in God's kingdom as they work in the world. God's kingdom should upend the way that we think about things should be in this world. The kingdom of God flips them on their head. So when we talked about Jesus letting the little children come to him and sit at his feet to sit on his lap, we hear Jesus say that we must become like these children. We must welcome God's kingdom like a child. It wasn't talking about the innocence of children. He was talking about the vulnerability of children and how that they had very little worth in that ancient culture. He was encouraging his followers to welcome God's kingdom as completely vulnerable people, to give up all pretense of security and safety, to be utterly and completely reliant upon God. Last week, we dealt with the story of a rich man who wanted to follow Jesus. And if you would remember, he was a virtuous man. He kept the commandments. Because of his wealth, he would have been highly respected and an influential member of the community because people associated wealth with virtue. And if you were wealthy, it was seen as an evidence of God's blessing, God's favor on you, as evidence of a holy life. So this man came, he ran to Jesus. He fell at his feet and asked him what he must do to inherit God's kingdom. And Jesus said, "Go, sell all that you have, give it to the poor, come and follow me." But that was too much for the rich man. He walked away broken, unable to bring himself to follow Jesus. The disciples saw this and they couldn't handle it. How could this man, the best of the best, if he couldn't get into God's kingdom, how could we? In God's kingdom, many who are the first will be the last, and many who are the last will be the first, is that enigmatic statement of Jesus. We talked about there being a danger in wealth. It's corrupting because it tricks us into relying on our own selves for safety instead of relying on God. So we're left with this nagging question. If Jesus' response to the rich man was to tell him to go and sell everything and give it to the poor and follow him, what's Jesus going to say when it comes to us desperately seeking him? Us who are among the richest people in the world. What does the upside down kingdom expect from us? Here in this chapter of Mark and in other places in other gospels, Jesus has this interesting way of making points. Someone will ask him a difficult question that oftentimes has a standard answer for those ancient Jews. Maybe it was because that answer no longer seems satisfactory, or maybe they were setting Jesus up because the answer was impossibly difficult. In every case, there was an assumed correct answer. Jesus, what are the grounds for divorce? Are we even allowed to get one? Moses said that if a man wrote a divorce certificate, then it could happen. Jesus, what do I need to do to be a part of God's kingdom? I seem to be doing the right things. Am I doing it right? Keeping all these commandments. In each of these cases, and even the story today, there seemed to be a right answer. Jesus hears the story. He hears the language they're using, and he takes it a step beyond their expectations. He pushes the envelope, and in many cases, he flips their understanding upside down. So you think that you could divorce someone by writing a certificate of divorce. You think that cheating on someone is grounds for a divorce. You think adultery is the deal breaker. Well, in God's kingdom, simply lusting after someone is adultery. Remarriage itself is an act of adultery, not only for the person getting remarried, but it makes their ex-spouse an adulterer too. You think you shouldn't be wasting my time with these worthless kids. Guess what? They're the gold standard of what you should be like because they're vulnerable without any preconceived notions of God's kingdom. You think keeping these commandments is going to get you into God's kingdom? Well, not only do you need to keep the commandments, but you need to sell everything. Give up your wealth. Give it to the poor. Give up your clout, your reputation. You can't have it both ways. It's either one or the other, God's kingdom or wealth. Think about this one. You think you're asked to love your neighbor in God's kingdom. Well, God's kingdom asks even more of you. In God's kingdom, God's love extends even to enemies. It's that pattern that happens with Jesus. There's a question, it comes with an expected answer, and Jesus responds with an even more extreme answer. He senses what people expect to hear and moves the goalpost even further. And that pattern continues today in today's passage from Mark. Mark 10, 35 through 45. Listen for God's word for you. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand and at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as the rulers lord it over them, and the great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." This is the word of the Lord. So against our better judgments as a family, we got a cat. A small little stray kitten our daughter has named Boomerang. Now, I say against our better judgment because while he certainly is cute and he is really a patient kitten who lets my daughter pick him up like a baby, those of you who have ever lived with a cat know this to be true. Inviting a cat to come and live with you means that you are going to be actively hunted by something in your own house. I actually learned this yesterday. A science writer by the name of Tom McNamee wrote a book called The Inner Life of a Cat, and he points out that by scientific estimates, we have been living with dogs for almost 100,000 years, at least domesticated dogs or service dogs, but we have only lived with cats as pets or service animals for 5,000 years. So they're a little bit wilder than dogs. So we've experienced the joy of living with a wild animal that is actively hunting us. Walking by the bed and a little cat paw appears from underneath, taking a swipe at my foot. My wife walks down the hall, and when all of a sudden a cat runs out in front of her and jumps like it's going to attack her. There's a whole new level of responsibility as a family. Not only putting up with the hunting, but actually caring for the cat, feeding him, playing with him. And everyone's favorite, cleaning the litter box. Boomerang's presence has led to a sharp uptick in the amount of "honey, can you do me a favors" being said in our house. Is that a phrase you use? Honey, can you do me a favor? It's a phrase often used in homes. You probably use it or something like it and don't always realize it. Honey, can you do me a favor? Can you do me a little favor? It's used almost as this throwaway line because we're mildly timid about asking someone right away to do something for us. Can you do me a favor? Will you clean the litter box before you go to bed? Yes, dear. Will you do me a favor? Sure. Will you make sure to take out the recycling tonight? Sure. It's a phrase we say to our close friends, maybe our family members, to our spouses, to our significant others. I don't know if you feel this way or not. I think I'm a little bit neurotic because there's a part of me that when I hear that little phrase, "Honey, will you do me a favor?" I think, this is a test and this is a trap. Proceed at your own peril. Because you never know what you're signing up for when you answer back. I think the assumption most of us have is that it's going to be something simple. Could you hand me the book from the coffee table? Would you mind picking up a prescription for me? Could you go vacuum the house a little bit before our guests come over? Something simple. But there's a part of me, if I'm totally honest, that thinks, whoa, 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 let's slow this thing down. You have no clue what you're getting yourself into when you say yes to that favor. The range of possible requests is just too vast. You could be agreeing to something that takes months or years. You could be agreeing to elective surgery, hosting dinner parties for hundreds, hand-knitting sweaters for orphan kittens. You have no clue what this request is going to be, so let's slow this thing down. Let me hear this request before I agree to anything. I'd love to say that I am the ever-loving husband, the husband that's always willing to serve, but even in my best moments, I usually end up answering, honey, would you do me a favor with, well, it depends on the favor. So on one hand, you can kind of respect the gumption of James and John because they had the guts just to say to Jesus, teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. Do you agree to that? But on the other hand, it seems rather childish and a pretty pathetic attempt to manipulate Jesus into giving them more power and prestige. So instead of following Jesus' path of flipping the world upside down, James and John are instead deciding to play a game with Jesus, hoping to secure places of honor and privilege in the kingdom. But Jesus doesn't fall for it. And he asks them, okay, what do you really want? Allow one of us to sit at your right hand and the other to sit at your left when you come into your glory. You see, the seat on the right hand of the king was the seat of honor. And the second most important seat was the seat to the left. James and John were playing a game to try to trick their way into being number one and number two in the new kingdom. This new kingdom Jesus kept talking about. And the whole thing is rather pathetic. In fact, the Gospel of Matthew took Mark's story, because that's right, Matthew cheated. He used Mark for a lot of his story, but when he took Mark's story, he rewrote it. He changed it and had James and John's mother be the one who asked Jesus if her boys could sit beside him in the new kingdom. It's just too shameful to be having apostles behaving like this. So let's pawn it off on dear old mom. Their game sounds strikingly similar to the words of Herod. Remember when Herod saw his daughter Herodias dancing and he was so transfixed, he told her, ask me whatever you wish and I'll give it to you. And what does she ask for? John the Baptist's head on a platter. But there they went about it, this pathetic scheme, James and John. What they were after didn't seem pathetic. It was power, honor, prestige. That's the way the world worked, or at least the way James and John saw the world working. Here they were with the guy they thought was going to be the next king. And it makes sense to try and lock in those positions of strength here in the early days. To some extent, I think we need to cut these two sons of Zebedee, often called the sons of thunder, some slack. Not because, well, it's because things frankly haven't changed a lot in the last 2,000 years. Power seems to be every bit as important today as it was back then, or at least that's what the endless amounts of campaign banners and yard signs and commercials seem to be communicating to me. Power and prestige indeed are still important. Now, I don't know if they did what they did because they wanted power or they feared they wouldn't have it. Either one seems like a pretty natural reaction to the situation they were in, especially the notion that they were acting on their fears. That's the one I tend to buy. Fear can cause us to do things we previously thought were unthinkable. Because of the death of 3,000 people and the fear that it would happen again, we spent $5.6 trillion starting a war in two nations. That's resulted in the deaths, either directly or indirectly, of 600,000 Iraqis and an occupation in Afghanistan that continues today. Because of fear, this week, A crazed man sent 13 pipe bombs to politicians all over the country because he feared these politicians. Because of fear, Dylan Ruth walked into a predominantly black church in Charleston and killed 9 of our black sisters and brothers. Because of fear of the survival of churches like ours, mainline churches who are dying across the country, we stopped engaging the question of what God would have us do. Instead, we worry more about budgets, worry about keeping things the way it's always been. We argue about who's in and who's out of the church, placing our comforts and budgets above God's radical call to welcoming. I think if you're looking for a reason why James and John made this ham-handed, pathetic attempt at consolidating their power, I think the reason is probably fear. Fear for their own status and security when God's new kingdom comes into being. And then Jesus responds to them, and it seems to go completely over their head. You don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup that I drink, or receive the baptism I receive? And they answer, yes, we can. And Jesus says, you will drink the cup I drink and receive the baptism I receive. James and John hear these words of Jesus and think, yes, we are partners in this ministry and we will be partners in your rule. We've been here with you since the beginning, and we will be here with you when everything is perfect, when you've made things right, when we kick out the Romans, when we booted out Herod. The new kingdom is here, we'll be there. And in their minds, Jesus seems to confirm it. Yes, you will drink the cup I drink, and you will receive the baptism I receive. But this is the dramatic irony playing out in Mark's gospel. We know Jesus' cup. We know what it is, and we know what Jesus' baptism leads to. We know where these roads lead. And James and John should have known better. That image of drinking from the cup has long represented death and judgment in ancient Judaism. Read the prophets like Jeremiah, and you'll read over and over about the cup of God's judgment. Jesus' baptism involves traveling down the same path of Jesus, a path that leads to the cross. So drinking the same cup as Jesus and sharing in his baptism meant something radically different than they thought. We know that full story, but they didn't. And we see in the book of Acts that James does drink from the same cup as Jesus, because in chapter 12, we hear Herod begins harassing the church, and Herod has James killed with a sword. Church tradition says John eventually became a leader in the church of Ephesus, where he died of old age. So even though he was not martyred like his brother James, he still walked the path of Jesus because he endured persecution and remained faithful. But it wasn't just James and John that didn't get it. Clearly, the other disciples didn't understand this upside-down kingdom, because they saw the attempted power grab by the sons of thunder, and they became incredibly angry with these brothers. You could see them beginning to bicker and chastising the brothers. It's not hard to imagine them saying things like, "Who do you think you are, asking to be at the right hand of the left hand? I've been with Jesus longer. You weren't even the first fisherman Jesus called. If it's going to be anyone at Jesus' right hand, it's going to be me." Jesus sees the 12 fighting about who's going to sit in places of honor. He's already seen this fight happen in the previous chapter when they were in Capernaum and the disciples kept debating who was going to be the greatest among them. And so you could sense Jesus' frustration with this consistent desire to see who's going to be the best, who has the most power. And he says to them, when you look at the nations around us, what do you see? You see rulers showing off their authority and power, and they're using it over their people. You see high-ranking officials ordering people just because they can. I know you see this because you complain about it. You call it tyranny. You talk about how unjust it is and how pointless it is. If you look at them and understand it, why are you spending your days trying to act like that? Why are you imitating the things you say you despise? You decry that type of power, and yet you clearly want it. It's not the way it's going to be in my kingdom. That's not the way it's going to be with you. And And so here we are, it's Reformation Sunday. That's why we sang that first hymn. And I think it seems fitting to talk about John Calvin a little bit. And John Calvin had a particular affinity for these verses. John Calvin wrote that this story contains a bright mirror of human vanity. Here are his words when talking about these passages. It shows that proper and holy zeal is often accompanied by ambition or some other vice of the flesh, so that they who follow Christ have a different object in view from what they ought to have. Did you catch that? Calvin is saying that even in our best moments, when we have our best thoughts, when we're doing our best actions, even in those moments, our thoughts and our actions still tend to be tainted by ambition for more power or prestige or influence, tainted by our own vanity or sense of self-preservation. Everything we do is a mix of motivations. Think about it. How often do you stop and think, why am I doing this? Why do I do the things I do? In most cases, the only time we stop to ask that question is when life has gone off the rails and we're engaging in some unhealthy, destructive behavior. I doubt many of us have ever stopped and asked what we're doing and why we're doing it when we're being our best selves, our best thoughts and our best actions. These verses, this story hits me particularly hard because I want win-win outcomes when I serve God. I want to preach in the service, the sermon, and yet have you love me at the same time. I want you to go tell everyone you meet, come to this church with me, our minister, he's this incredible preacher, you'll love him. He's wise, he's humble, he's insightful, he's witty, he's funny, and oh, so good looking. I want you, when I go and work for justice in our community and meet with community leaders, I want them to walk away saying, man, that guy's dynamic. He really motivates people to get to work. What an impressive leader. I want that win-win gospel. I want that cheap grace. Don't give me that win-lose gospel where I serve God and it cost me something. Don't give me that costly grace. So Jesus responds, whoever wants to be great will be your servant. Whoever wants to be first among you will be a slave to all. There's Jesus with that escalating thing we talked about earlier. He's blowing right past that assumed answer. He's heightening it all. He takes great and he raises it to first. He takes servant and he raises it to serve. He takes your and he elevates it to all. You want to be great? No, you want to be first, the best, the highest? Then you got to be a servant. No, you got to take it further. You got to be a slave, not to this little group right here. Nope. God's love goes further. You got to be a slave to all. That's what it takes to be first in God's kingdom. Because God's kingdom isn't oriented around power. It's upside down. It's built around service. And in this upside down kingdom, greatness is not measured by power or prestige. It's measured by one's commitment to serving others in Jesus' name. So Jesus' challenge to us today is to face our tendency to be modern-day sons and daughters of Zebedee, to be just like James and John. So we're challenged to deal with our issues, to expose our motivations, to work out our insecurities that motivate us to act out of fear, greed, and desires for power and prestige and safety. Henry Newman said it this way: only those who face their wounded condition can be available for healing, and so enter a new way of living. Quite bluntly, Jesus is calling us to sort out our crap so that we might be able to serve more than we are served. That's how it's supposed to be in God's upside down kingdom. So as I close this sermon, I want to close us with a prayer that I feel best illustrates this, words that beautifully demonstrate this for us. And it is a prayer of St. Francis of Assisi. So won't you bow your heads in prayer with me? O divine Master, grant that I may not seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.